Over 2,000 years ago, the Greek philosopher Heraclitus described men in battle. He said, "Out of every 100 men, 10 should not even be there. 80 are just targets. 9 are the real fighters, and we are lucky to have them, for they make the battle. But the one is a warrior, and he will bring the others back." My name is Byrne Bennett, and I live in Reardan, Washington. I'm the nephew of Medal of Honor recipient Joe Mann. My mother, Irene, was his youngest sister. Joe was born July 8, 1922 on a wheat farm in Reardan, Washington. He came from a family of 11. He was the middle child of that family. Joe grew up on a mule ranch north of Reardan. And on the county map in the early 40s, it was actually designated on the map the Mule Ranch. That was the name of it. I don't know how many mules they had, but I know my grandfather loved his mules. He named all the mules. When they brought mechanization into farming, he refused to get a tractor because he didn't want to give up his mules. My great-grandfather, John William Mann, started Mule Days at the turn of the century, which goes on today. It happens the first Saturday of every June in Reardan. So the mule is a big part of our local history, and I'm proud that my family is part of that history. He was a sickly child. When he was young, he had appendicitis, tonsillitis, and mastoiditis, and he missed a lot of school, so he's held back a year. As he grew older, he became a risk taker. He got kicked in the head by a mule, got hit in the head with an axe. I had several accidents, several broken bones, missing teeth. One of his friends called him fearless. And as he grew, he continued being fearless. In a football game in 1941, he broke his collarbone and he refused to leave the game when the coach told him to, which I think became a foreshadowing of what was going to happen later in his life. He was the favorite sibling of many of his siblings. I know my mother and my aunt said that he enjoyed spending time with them. He would fly kites with them, ride bikes with them, take them fishing, take them swimming. He built toys for them. He played pranks on them. And my Aunt Helen said that her fondest memory of Joe was when he took her to the dance, the homecoming dance, when she was a freshman because nobody else asked her to go. When Joe was a senior in high school, he started going to the Lutheran church. The pastor there saw something in Joe and he wanted to mentor him. He saw potential or something, I'm not sure what. But Joe's family had never gone to church before, and so he decided to visit the Lutheran church, and he and the pastor developed a friendship. Eventually, the church obtained a cross to put on the steeple, and nobody wanted to put it up there because it didn't have a ladder and is very steep. And so Joe volunteered to put a ladder up onto the steeple, which he tied with a rope. He carried the cross up there and he placed the cross on top of the steeple. Evidently, the whole town gathered. They were amazed. They were impressed. And fortunately, we have a picture of that to kind of memorialize that moment. Yes, at the same time that Joe was being mentored by this pastor named Carl Ufer, he started attending Luther League. And I think that was a weekly event where they would get together with other kids and learn about the Lutheran faith. And eventually he joined the Lutheran church. He was confirmed in the Lutheran church. He was baptized. And his younger siblings were so inspired by Joe and his involvement with the Lutheran church that they also joined Luther League and were also confirmed and baptized in the Lutheran church. So he's the first one to attend church, and he was actually the one who got the rest of his family attending as well. In 1941, Joe graduated from Reardan High School in a class of 30. With the war raging in Europe, he enlisted in the U.S. Army. In 1942, he joined the Army at Fort Lewis. His goal was to become a pilot. He had 2 older brothers, Jack and Roy, who were pilots with the Army Air Corps. He grew up in a household that had model airplanes everywhere because they loved flying. They often went to Felts Field to watch the planes take off and land, and so that was his desire to become a pilot. But unfortunately, his football injury from high school kept him from becoming a pilot because he failed the physical. They called it retained hardware in his shoulder. So he instead decided to become a paratrooper. 1941 was when they started the paratroopers in the U.S. Army, and he was one of the first ones to join as a paratrooper. So he signed up. and was sent to Camp Toccoa, Georgia. But prior to leaving, getting on the train in Reardan, he said to my mother, Irene, take good care of yourself, okay? And that was the last words that he ever spoke to her. Well, he went to basic training at Fort Lewis, and that is when he decided to become a paratrooper, so they shipped him to Camp Toccoa, Georgia. And I believe he was there for maybe half a year, I'm not sure. But he was assigned to the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division, which is the same regiment that the Band of Brothers were in. He had a sergeant there named Sergeant Skeen, who for some reason despised him from day one. He harassed Joe for a year, and some of Joe's friends said that Skeen's goal was for Joe to commit insubordination so he could kick him out of the 506th. And his friends couldn't figure out why Skeen hated him so much, but he just singled him out of everybody to make an example of him. After a year, Skeen said something to Joe, and Joe had finally had enough. He said something or did something, and he was punished by being transferred out of the 506th into the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment. So he was sent to Fort Bragg, and at Fort Bragg, right before he was kicked out of the 506th, he had a conversation with another soldier named Jim Pee Wee Martin. And they sat on a dumpster at Fort Bragg commiserating over Joe's transfer, which they thought was unfair. And the last words that Joe said to Pee Wee were, "You haven't heard the last of me." From that point on, he was shipped to England for training for a year. He was shipped to England in preparation for the invasion of Normandy. And during the last training exercise before the invasion, it's called Exercise Eagle, the men jumped out of airplanes on a windy, dark night in the Kennet Valley in England. And many men were blown off course. Some hit rock walls, some hit fences. 426 paratroopers broke bones in that jump. Joe was fortunate that he didn't break any bones, but he did suffer a double hernia. And so he was put in an English hospital for 8 weeks. Because of that, he missed the invasion of Normandy. On September 17th, 1944, Joe was back in jump status, and he participated in Operation Market Garden, which took place in Holland, September 17th through September 19th. And he was a lead scout. His job was to lead his men from the drop zone where they landed to the bridge where they were to take control of the bridge so that the British Army 30 Corps could cross over the bridge and drive the Germans out of Holland. Yes, they landed in Holland at 1 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. It was a hot, sunny day, one of the best days they'd had in Holland that fall. And fortunately, a farmer had plowed the land zone before they jumped, not knowing that they were going to use it as a landing zone. So many of the soldiers said that it was the softest landing they had in all of their training or in battle. So they landed in Holland, and their goal was to take the bridge over the Wilhelmina Canal. Unfortunately, there were Germans in Best that they were not aware of. Army intelligence had told them that there would be no Germans in the area, so they thought that they would be able to take it in about an hour. But unfortunately, Army intelligence was wrong because 1,200 Germans had landed in Best the day before. So the American troops immediately found that they had a lot of enemy forces facing them as soon as they hit the drop zone. Many men were shot and killed. There's a lot of confusion around Best as the battle took place. When the paratroopers landed at the drop zone, they had to get to the bridge, and they were going to use the steeple in Best as a guide to get to the bridge. Unfortunately, Captain Robert Jones, who was leading the men, somehow got disoriented, and he lost track of the steeple. And they got off course, and they were not able to get to the bridge. It threw them kind of way out of whack. And it was from that point on, it was a chore to get to the bridge in a timely manner. I've been to Best 7 times, and I've seen the steeple many times. I've been in that church many times, and it is quite a landmark. And the plan was good, but somehow it didn't work out, and it caused a lot of problems later for the men because it delayed them getting to the bridge. And who knows what would have happened if they'd gotten there earlier. So Joe's unit was told to proceed to the bridge by themselves because everybody else had to stay in Best to fight the Germans. So Joe's job was to lead the men to the bridge, which is about 1.5 miles away. In between the bridge was a forest, a swampy marsh, and a dike that took them to the Wilhelmina Canal. And then they had to follow the dike to the bridge that they were supposed to take from the Germans. They got bogged down in the forest because the Germans had set up machine guns along these fire lanes. And every time they tried to cross a fire lane, the Germans would shoot down the row and shoot the Americans. That held them up for quite a while. It started getting dark, and they could see that it was going to take a lot longer than an hour to actually get to the bridge. So after they got through the forest, he led them through a marsh and around the marsh to the dike. By then it was 9 o'clock at night, which is 8 hours longer than it should have taken. It was pitch black. So the American troops still had not found the bridge. So Joe led his men down the dike, and in the distance he saw the silhouette of the bridge. So he left his platoon of 44 men at the canal, and he went to try to find the bridge up close to see how many Germans were there. So he crawled within about 60 yards of the bridge, and he looked up and he saw about 200 men on the bridge. So they were outnumbered immediately 4-1 and surrounded. The one thing that Joe didn't know was that there were Germans in his immediate vicinity. He crawled into their guard sector, and a German soldier stepped off the bridge and walked in the dark straight at him. And there's nothing he could do. He couldn't get away because it would signal to the Germans that he was there and that the Americans were nearby. So he lay face down in the grass for 40 minutes as this German walked tight circles around him, many times his boots were inches from his face. So eventually there was a diversion in the distance that allowed Joe to jump up and kill the guard and run back to his platoon by the bridge. And eyewitnesses said that he dodged bullets from 5 machine guns as he ran back to the platoon. But it was too late to take the bridge that night, and they realized that there were so many more Germans in them that they had to think about what they're going to do to try to take it the next morning. The next morning, September 18th, the American paratroopers were still trying to figure out how to take the bridge because there's only 44 men compared to 200 Germans on the bridge, and it looked like an impossible task. But by now the Germans had discovered their position by the canal, and they started shooting at them with 88 millimeter guns. And they also exploded the bridge. They planted an explosive device on the bridge, blew it up. The bridge blew sky high, and all the concrete rubble came down, and their objective was lost. They no longer had a bridge to protect and to seize. It was gone. So the soldiers now are in a position to just try to get out of there alive. But the Germans kept firing at them with 88 millimeter guns, and many of the engineers who were in Joe's group, to bolster their numbers, fled. About 26 men swam across the canal or ran into the woods, basically deserted Joe and the rest of his platoon. That left 15 soldiers to face 200 Germans, which was an insurmountable task. As the Americans fought next to the canal against the Germans, which were totally outnumbering them, American Thunderbolt fighter planes flew overhead, and this brought great relief to the Americans because finally there was somebody there to help them get out of this situation. So the airplanes flew down out of the clouds, started shooting, but unfortunately they were shooting at Joe and his 15 comrades. They thought they were the Germans. The Germans just sat on the bridge, or what was left of the bridge, and they watched as the Americans got shot. So the Americans didn't really know what to do at that point. Many of them had lost hope. Joe had had enough. He grabbed a bazooka and he went out in search of the 88 millimeter gun that kept shooting at them at their position by the canal. He fired 2 rounds and he blew the 88 millimeter gun up, and he also blew up their ammunition stockpile. He hid in the bridge's rubble for about an hour, taking pot shots at the Germans who were still in that area. 6 of the Germans spotted him, and they ran directly at him. He jumped out from behind the rubble, and in exposed position, he fought them one by one, killing all 6 Germans. By doing that, he got shot 4 times, once in each shoulder and once in each lower arm. He staggered back to his platoon by the canal, and they wrapped his arms in bandages and secured them to his body like a straitjacket. He was told to get into the trench with the other wounded, but he refused. He said, "I want to go back into battle. I can still fight." So he grabbed a gun, even though his arms were bandaged to his side, and he went back into battle. Later that afternoon, the Germans continued to bombard them with other 88 millimeter shells. And Joe was somehow wriggled out of his bandage, and he was shooting one-armed at the enemy until he was wounded again with shrapnel. That evening, he was severely wounded. He went into shock. His teeth chattered. He shook uncontrollably. And he was told to go back into the foxhole with the wounded. And this time he agreed to do that. But in the middle of the night, it started raining. It was cold. It was miserable. And he was watching men die around him. And he said, a sworn statement from one of his buddies said that Joe told him, "I can't stay here any longer. I can't watch you guys die." And so he snuck out of the foxhole in the middle of the night to go searching for the other men who were still unwounded, able to fight. And there were only 6 men left. So he climbed over the dike. He found these 6 men huddled together on the other side of the dike in a trench. And he went to the lieutenant and said that, I want to fight. Let me into the foxhole. I want to fight with you guys. The lieutenant said, "You can't fight. You're wounded. You can't do anything. You're finished. Go back to the other foxhole." And Joe said, "I can't go back. People are dying. I'm not going to go back. Let me stay here." So the lieutenant saw how determined he was, that he wasn't going to get rid of Joe. He said, "Okay, I'm going to let you into the foxhole." And Joe said, "Okay, thank you. Tonight I'm going to stand guard. I can't really use my arms, but I will stand guard so that the other men can sleep, because surely the Germans are going to attack in the morning." So the next morning, Joe was correct. The Germans mounted an attack on that trench. It was a foggy morning, and the Americans saw misty figures or shadowy figures coming through the mist at the foxhole. When they were about 50 feet away, the Germans started throwing potato masher grenades into the trench. One of the first grenade actually landed next to one of Joe's buddies, and the grenade was set for approximately 5 seconds. The soldier was able to pick it up and throw it out of the trench before it exploded. The second grenade hit the machine gun and blew up in the machine gunner's face, blowing out one eye out of its socket and blinding the other eye. A third grenade landed right next to the bloodied machine gunner who had just gotten hit. Miraculously, he groped for it on the ground. He was able to pick it up and throw it out before it exploded. The fourth grenade landed in the ground, on the ground next to Joe. His arms were bandaged to his side. Nobody else could get to it. The men all looked at each other, turned their backs, covered their heads, all knowing that they were going to die. And Joe looked at his lieutenant and said, "I'll take this one." And he turned his back and he pushed himself off of the trench wall and fell on the grenade with his back. The grenade blew him off the ground and into the arms of his lieutenant. And he looked into his lieutenant's eyes and calmly said, "My back is gone." And then he died a few seconds later without a cry or a whimper. After Joe was killed, one of the soldiers looked at the lieutenant and said, "Is it time?" asking whether or not they should surrender. And the lieutenant nodded and said yes. So they raised a white flag on the end of an M1 rifle and surrendered. The Germans came into the trench, but before the Germans got there, one of Joe's comrades, one of his buddies, threw his body over a dead comrade who had just been killed and lay there for 10 hours as a German set up a machine gun just feet away from him for the rest of the day. Another soldier, as they were getting marched off, jumped into a foxhole and pulled a branch over the foxhole and hid for another 10 hours while another machine gun was set up next to him. So both of those men concealed themselves amongst the enemy for 10 hours. Eventually, they heard Allied tanks come, and the Germans started to panic. And at that time, the two Americans who were hiding jumped from their hiding place, grabbed weapons, and returned to the battle. The other men who were marched off to a hospital infirmary that had been turned into a prison overtook the German guards, took their weapons, and held them captive until the Allied troops came in and rescued them. So the 6 men who Joe saved were captured, but they then captured their capturers and returned to battle. Yes, several days after the men were captured and after they were rescued by the Allied troops, General S.L.A. Marshall, who was an Army historian at that time, interviewed the men in a cattle barn in Holland to try to figure out how they had survived, because all that anybody knew about these men at what they called the Battle of Best is that they were wiped out. They were called the Lost Patrol because they were sent to take the bridge and they were never heard from again. So Marshall wanted to find out how they had actually survived this fierce battle when they were so outnumbered. So he sat them down in a cattle barn and interviewed each of the men, and they refused to tell him what happened. They hemmed and hawed. They told contradictory versions of what happened. And finally, one soldier named James Hoyle, who was the other scout with Joe, spoke up and said, "We haven't been honest with you, sir. I need to tell you what happened. The reason we've not been forthcoming is because our lieutenant here is ashamed that we got captured, and we made a pact not to tell what happened. But it's not fair to our buddy Joe Mann. I have to tell you what he did. He's the bravest man we ever knew, and I need to tell you what he did because he deserves it. So we're going to tell you his story." From then on, they gave sworn affidavits. They gave personal accounts of what happened, and Marshall put Joe in for the Medal of Honor after that. From his 3 days in battle, September 17th through the 19th, 1944, Joe was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, the Bronze Star, and 5 Purple Hearts. 1 year after he was awarded the Medal of Honor, it was presented to my grandfather, Henry Mann, at the Baxter General Hospital in Spokane. In 1956, the Dutch raised money to build a monument in honor of Joe, and my grandparents flew to Holland the first time they'd ever flown or been anywhere, and they dedicated the monument in Best Holland. It's a monument of a pelican, which in Greek mythology represents self-sacrificed. Evidently, a mother pelican will tear meat off its breast to feed its children if they are dying and don't have any food. So they thought that would be an appropriate symbol of Joe's self-sacrifice. So that was 10 years after his death, roughly. And then in 1987, another monument was unveiled at the site where he was killed. So he has 2 monuments in Best Holland. The Dutch also, they built a nature park, about 600-acre nature park that they named the Joe Mann Nature Park. There's an amphitheater there where they hold plays to this day. There's the Joe Mann Pavilion Restaurant right near the Pelican Monument. He's honored at the City Hall in Best. His casket flag is there along with his trench knife and his prayer book and other artifacts like that. In 1950, the Army commissioned a ship named the USNS Joe Mann. There's a transport ship, I believe. In 2009, the Spokane VA Hospital was renamed the Mann Grandstaff VA Medical Center. At Fort Campbell, the movie theater was named the Joe Mann Theater. At Fort Jackson, there's a Joe Mann banquet room. At Fort Benning, there's Joe Mann Field. Fort Lewis, there's Joe Mann Avenue. So he's been honored and recognized all around the U.S. as well as Europe. Well, I'm not sure what year it was. I think it might have been 1969. There's a soldier from Moses Lake, Washington named Joe Hooper who did a report on Joe for a school project, and he came to Reardan, tried to interview people who knew Joe's family and learn a little bit about Joe's life. He went back to his high school and wrote his report on Joe. And he was so inspired by Joe's story that he joined the 101st Airborne Division at a high school and became a paratrooper just like Joe did. He eventually went to Vietnam and he fought, and he had been compared to soldier Audie Murphy in World War II, who was highly decorated. Joe Hooper became one of the most decorated soldiers in the war. He also received the Medal of Honor. And he came back to the U.S. and he attended one of the ceremonies in 1969 in Best at the Pelican Monument. Early in the morning, before it was light, it was said that Joe Hooper just sat on the ground staring at the monument for 2 hours before anybody else showed up for this ceremony. And eventually, before he got up to leave, he shimmied up the monument, which is 22 feet high, and he placed his Medal of Honor on the Pelican, and then he left. And he came back with everybody else later for the ceremony that day, and they all saw this Medal of Honor hanging up there. And Joe Hooper said that Joe Mann was his inspiration, and the medal really belonged to Joe Mann for inspiring him to do what he did in Vietnam. So that medal is now hanging in Best Holland with some of Joe's memorabilia. Every year since, I think, the 25th anniversary of Operation Market Garden, 1969, I think, was the first Remember September festivity in Holland. And they would bring over World War II veterans to celebrate that, and there'd be parades, festivals, ceremonies, and they'd also have an annual reading of Joe's Medal of Honor citation at the Pelican Monument, and that has happened every year since then. I've been there 7 times and attended those events, and it's amazing to see the admiration that the Dutch have for the American soldier. There are reenactments, there are convoys of hundreds of World War II era vehicles, speeches, banquets with the mayor, and my mother was there 8 times, and she was honored to meet the Queen, and she was treated like a celebrity because of her brother. And she was always a little embarrassed about that because it was nothing that she did, but the people honored Joe so much that they just wanted to meet somebody who was in his family. So that's a celebration that should be an inspiration to Americans and maybe an example of how we should treat our veterans here.